This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
We have been talking about grace and empathy and a people first culture. Between you, me and Kristen have talked about that. We're working through a Church Called TOV, and in some sort of order around this circle of TOV, the circle of goodness that Mcknight and Barringer talk about in the book, and the various categories that perhaps we as followers of Jesus should think about, and particularly if we're thinking in terms of shaping the church, what the church should look like. And that brings us to the conversation today, where we're talking about nurturing truth. The next piece of the circle is this notion of truth, that TOV churches nurture truth. Good churches pursue truth, and Mcknight and Barringer talk about how that therefore means that these churches must resist the temptation to perpetrate. I'm going to use a strong term, but to perpetrate false narrative. And I think that frames our conversation for us. Let me just one more comment, because there's a lot you could talk about when it comes to truth in the Bible and truth in the church, but particularly we want to think a little bit about how truth is engaged within the church itself. So avoiding conversations about truth wars, as they talk about nowadays, and is there such a thing of truth, but actually how do we tell the truth as the church?
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make at the start of a conversation like this, is that there is a conversation out there, and it's, and it's a popular one still, and I think Lee Strobel kind of kicked that one off big time, at least early on in some of his in his books and commentary around the case for Christ, and can we understand that something could be true? Is there evidence for that? And what is absolute truth? And how do we determine, those types of things? And that's been a popular kind of apologetic conversation, if you will. But Scott and Laura take a very different approach to how they would define truth within a church called TOV. And it's that truth telling piece. And I think that's the important aspect, is the telling of the truth and the conversations and the way things are framed and talked about and discussed and shared, that they really focus in on. And I love how they start the chapter. If anyone's read it, they start by talking about kids and how kids are the natural truth tellers. That's just a part of who they are. They're very blunt. They're very honest. I've had, some of my own kids at times come up, pat my belly and go, "Dad, you got a big belly," right? And I'm just like, "Thank you." Like but they're just brutally, I immediately went to the exercise bike, but they're just brutally honest. And they kind of have fun talking about, maybe this is a bit of what Jesus means when he says, hey, if you want to enter the kingdom of God, you have to become like kids. You got to become like these children. This idea of telling the truth within a church culture, and it's a hard one, and it's one that I think culturally has affected church in a lot of ways, and culture and how we behave. And I think we've taken some of our behaviors from culture around us, because we live right now in a really curated culture, in a culture that when we post things on social media, we post half-true things, the parts we want people to see, the parts of the story we want people to hear. And we have the ability to do so because we have all of these apps and different things in front of us that allow us to curate. And I think we've taken some cues from culture on that, and we've done that within a church context. So I love that they have the conversation in here, and that a part of their goodness circle is to say, well, let's explore what it looks like to be a truth-telling church.
So pick up on that word that you used. Maybe I'm just going to pick on it because it's a word I like in a whole host of different ways. But the curation of truth as a cultural piece for us right now. I feel like that might be a good sort of a spot just to sit and think about that just for a second. So I always sound like a Luddite when I say this, but I think social media has formed and shaped so much of our culture. And I think there's some really, really destructive aspects of social media that we ignore. But one of the fascinating things is how it has changed perceptions of people. And so, our celebrities are these highly curated people. I was watching a show the other day there, and they were talking about sports, some sports stars, and one of the former sports stars was there, and he was like, these interviews after the sport is finished are not, where they look like, let's just throw the microphone in the face of the sports star and ask them a key question. But this retired star said, like we're coached on all of this stuff behind the scenes. So we're told, and by the way, you're probably going to get asked about this after the game. This is what your answer to that is, and you're probably going to say about this. We'd like you to bring attention to this, so make sure you're talking about these decisions made against. And so what appears like hey, we just threw the microphone in, is actually curated truth.
It's why you get the joke about all the sports commentators after you watch any sport. Pick on one, and they'll ask a question, how are things going? Yeah, well, we did some of this well, and we need to work better here. And like, they're all the same. My wife mocks them relentlessly when I'm watching sports on the TV, because she knows exactly. She'll just be like, I know exactly how they're going to answer this question. It is all curated.
And so it creates this impression that we have like truth and falsehoods, right? And that's like, we can understand that, but somewhere in between truth and falsehoods, there's like half truths, and then sort of, they talk about white lies. And then there's this thing I remember, one of my friends used to use this phrase all the time. He said there's also telling the truth with the intent to deceive. And and then there's telling half the truth as if it's the whole truth, right? So, and these are things that we sort of encounter, I think, quite regularly in life. So I'm going to tell you the truth, but actually I'm going to tell the truth in such a way that clearly you're going to reach the wrong conclusion as a result of my telling you the truth. And so I don't know if you've got comments on that, but I think that's some of the murkiness that we deal with in terms of discourse around truth.
Well, 100%. And again, when, to continue this conversation around curation, there's this pressure, I think, personally. I think, even family units, as far as, what's our family known for, move it into jobs, organizations, church communities, you name it, there can be this pressure of your identity. And you can tell stories in a way that help people get to the conclusion you want them to get to, with certain truths that you nitpick within lots of your different memories and lots of the different things and experiences that have actually happened, to curate the story that you want people to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And it can get messy.
I was thinking about like even let's just stay with the Instagram example. There was a period where Instagram first came out that had all these filters, and you could quite radically enhance and adjust. Well, I say enhance, even that. Alter would be a better word than enhance. Enhance assumes that you're making things better, but that's another conversation perhaps. But this sort of, you could radically alter your appearance, and then something happened with Instagram where almost everybody realized that's what's happening. So all of our pictures on Instagram look hideously better than we actually. And again, I'm making a bias there. That it's funny how language is so deeply rooted in us. We say better, but again, is unnatural better? There's a good question perhaps to ask. But so then everybody ditched that, right? And then all of a sudden they became the no filter hashtag. Here's my picture, but it's got no filter. But we all know that people were curating the scene and taking hundreds and hundreds of shots until they got the one that was just right. So here's my no filter picture that took me an hour and 30 minutes to stage so that it looked like there was no filter. So yes, it's true, there's no filter, but what I want you to get from my comment that there's no filter is radically different than what actually happened. And I think this is what I'm thinking about when we talk about, telling some of the truth as if it's the whole truth, or telling the truth in such a way that it has deceitfulness to it. And I think because this is the sort of climate that we're in, the question is how we as the church navigate a culture where truth, I encountered the term truthiness a few years ago, and it kind of haunts me. So there's something, like truth to me is binary, but now we're dealing with, it's truthy.
kind of truth.
Yes, exactly. And I'm not quite sure how that works, but it's kind of terrifying when we start talking about, Paul says in First Timothy, the church should have a foundational relationship with truth. That truth should be something that we actually rely deeply upon, and actually everything else we do is built upon that truth. The inverse being, if the church starts to think of truth, and again, I'm not talking about that philosophical discussion of truth, but I'm talking about our practices. If we start thinking that telling the truth becomes negotiable, Paul seems to be implying to Timothy that there's a level where our foundations start to get really, really shaky.
Yes.
I feel like the pastor, for want of a better example at the minute, but the pastor should be a truth teller, and that should be something you just accept. And now, goodness, I could be hideously misquoted here, but I feel like you should have an assumption that your pastor is telling the truth. Like, I don't feel like that's a big ask. And but if people are reading Church Called TOV with us, of course the whole premise of the book is that that's not what's happening on too regular a situation.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, in this chapter specifically, Laura and Scott are talking a lot about the Willow Creek conversation and all that has gone on there, and the hiding of truth and trying to suppress it, and all of that, and how that comes to the surface. And so I like how Scott and Laura begin this chapter, talking about this surrender to truth. It starts with a posture to create this culture of truth telling and being willing to acknowledge that, and even practice it. If we're going to do it well, it starts by surrendering to the truth in general. And I think that's potentially the most difficult part of the whole process, is the first step. I think once you get to a place where we're willing to surrender to the truth, and now that's a loaded statement in and of itself that probably, takes some unpacking, and you don't just leave as it is. But when we're willing to surrender to the truth, the working out of that process then becomes a whole lot easier, because the hardest part is for us to actually just release control. And we do it all the time, not just in truth telling, but in a lot of ways when it comes to even what it means to follow Jesus. And it comes back to our conversation last week of fear and trying to control, and which leads to legalism and a whole whack of other things. They start by saying, actually, if you're going to have this culture created, you're going to start by surrendering to the truth. And then out of that is actually where you begin to find healing, and where you discover that, the true you start to begin to understand what Jesus means when he says, well, the truth will set you free.
And so thinking about the challenges that we face, it's interesting to note. So tell the truth. Okay, well, that seems pretty straightforward, and at some level, innocuous as a statement. But like Mcknight talks about how, so if God is the truth, our faith is rooted in truth, we're called to walk in the truth. All of that stuff preaches really easily. But he then says, so therefore anything that opposes the truth or undermines the truth is not of God. Right?
Yes.
And so continue to build our sort of spectrum of the question of truth telling and its opposite. What is the opposite of truth telling? Well, lying would be one. And I wonder how often we intentionally lie, right? I don't know. I kind of get the feeling like not very often. I'm not sure how often. Correct me. Maybe I'm completely living in a bubble here. But how often do people sit down and go, "I am going to not tell the truth here"? Like cognitively make the process. I am going to not tell the truth here. I wonder how often that happens, right? However,
yeah,
and this is where I find Mcknight throws out a couple of other pieces of language there. So let's hold that question. So here's the question that's in the air. David is unsure how often people intentionally lie. All right. David may have sort of invalid trust in humans. That's also out there to be considered. But here's another one. What about cover-ups, suppression of the truth, gaslighting, and spin? Right. And I wonder how often people, like say, you say, "Oh, I'm going to absolutely lie in this situation," or how often is it much more complex than that we actually start to buy into the narratives that we tell ourselves, that therefore I'm going to try and insist that my version of the story is the one that's told, that my version of the story is the one that people believe, and therefore what's going on cognitively isn't so much I'm going to pursue a lie here, but genuinely I start to buy into my own hype. I start to buy into my version of the story is the right one.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure that many of us are smart enough to create a full-on blatant everything is a lie that sounds realistic. You know what I mean? That actually makes sense and connects the dots on the fly. At least I'm not, but I know even in
I like how you've tried to come towards my position, but in an insulting way. So I'd be like, welcome. I don't think humans intentionally lie, and you've got yes because they're not smart enough, right? So I'm really
yes. Yes, but it's
want
true.
to own the fact that you've come to with me, but insulted everybody at the same time.
Well, if we're gonna go down, we're gonna go down with it, fully, and we're gonna commit to it. But think about it, right? Like I can tell you stories where I tried to commit a full lie as a kid. Like I have some, and you're trying to tell this, and my parents are looking at me funny, and then you're trying to add details, and it's not connecting, and everyone knows. Everyone knows.
I love the audacity of it, though. When I was 9, when I was 9, I punched my friend square in the face, right, middle of the nose, like took him down, and tried to talk my way out of it. To decided failure, to be honest. But I look back and think, man, I really thought I had a chance of talking my way out of that one.
Yeah. So
that's my confession for the night.
Yeah, and we have seen it. But we know, and I'm sure it's a learned behavior because of some of this, that if we can tell some of the details that are true, that make it believable because they are, that if we omit certain parts and exaggerate a little bit and spin, maybe, just maybe we'll get away with it. And sometimes we do, and that then, trains us to do that. Now, some of that is too, and this is a whole nother conversation, is as you tell that story that many times with exaggerations, omitting things, what happens in your brain chemistry and how you start to even believe that and get yourself into a space where you're saying, no, this is actually what happened and it's not, is a fascinating conversation, even just about the implications in our biology of what happens when we resist being truth tellers, which I'm not smart enough to go into all of the biology of it, but I've read a little bit about it, and that's where I'm going to end it, because there's people way smarter than me that will tell me everything that I just misquoted. But there is that sense of how our brain chemistry does work in some of that too, which is just interesting, right? Like we can get ourselves into trouble without even thinking, well, it's just a little spin. It's a little omission. I want to spin a narrative here. I want someone to look at it this way. And what that even does for our own psychology.
Well, I mean, and I realize you've set me up here because I want to make a comment on this, but therefore I'm going to sound like I think I'm smart enough to make a comment on this. So,
so I've insulted people and then set you up to make, nice.
It's true, man. You're on form this evening.
Yeah, nice.
I think this is Dean Burnett in his book on the brain, Dean Burnett's book, The Idiot Brain. It's on my shelf in the office, not here. So I think that's the title, The Idiot Brain. Fantastic. Dean Burnett's a comedian and a neuroscientist. So it really makes good reading with a lot of science in it. And, I think it's in that book of his that he talks about how memories are moved around in our brain. And so what happens is we encounter an experience, and if you actually brain scan somebody while they talk about something that just happened to them, they can tell which part of the brain that experience that is being accessed to tell this data. This might be common knowledge, so forgive me if it is, but what they notice is the more that you tell an experience that actually happened to you, that actually starts to move where it's stored in your brain, and the more you tell it, it actually moves into the part of your brain that remembers stories and memories in a different way than your experiences. Which means that when you tell a story for the first time, if you insert falsehoods into that story and then continue to retell that story with those falsehoods, eventually you will start to remember the story as you've told it. So then if you were dumped onto a lie detector, you would pass the lie detector with flying colors, because actually you've retold this memory enough times with the falsehoods added to it. I mean, I'm not talking about massive falsehoods. I mean, subtle falsehoods. Yeah. You start to think of the story differently. This is what makes gaslighting so powerful, because the same can be done to you. If somebody insists that your understanding of the story is wrong and exposes you to their version of the story often enough, eventually you start to remember the story that way as well. And that's what makes gaslighting so dangerous, is that there's a period where your sanity is being questioned as, do you really understand what happened here? But then eventually you just accept that this is what's happened here. And it's quite, that can be very malicious. But again, we're into this field of not sticking to the truth. Actually has some quite, lies are sticky, even in terms of our neuroscience. Lies can get stuck in. And this is why I think, Mcknight and Barringer talk about resisting false narrative. Yes. False narrative is powerful. You can actually start to believe false narrative if you really commit to it. And if you have a false narrative, it is possible that you can eventually start to believe in your false narrative as if it was true, even though it's a false narrative that you yourself have perpetrated. I mean, that's quite complex and also highly toxic if you think about it.
Oh, 100%. I'm glad you brought that up, because I remember us having a conversation at the lunch table about that, and that's what triggered it. And I'm glad you were in a place to make a comment about it, because you had read the book and you had mentioned it to me in the first place. So I'm glad you went there. But I mean, there's complexities at that level. And then there's also really practical complexities too, of just, how we define what is truth. And we've had some teaching on that, and more, or maybe the better question is, who is truth, right? Because you get this understanding as we look at scripture, that understanding truth, living out the truth, it's not just a verbal answer in the sense of just a head knowledge piece. When we read the story of the gospel, we discover that truth comes in human form, and shows us a way to live in that sense. So maybe we want to, start to unpack some of that as well. Before we get too far out of our field, maybe we'll come back to our lane. Which is in more theology based conversation.
This week's Short Circle, David and Tyson talk about things of which they have no experience or knowledge whatsoever, but they have talk read about one book confidently.
Yeah, that's right. They have read one book and think they're expert. So,
and even that's unproven. They are aware of a book.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's on a shelf somewhere.
Yeah, it's true. The title listed might not even be the title of the book in question. I think that the representation of Jesus in John's gospel is an interesting one at this point. As you said, he is the personification of truth. So Jesus, John 14:6, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And what's interesting is that the way John presents Jesus and how he introduces us to Jesus is this idea that truth now is more than just a concept, but it is actually personified in who Jesus is. And you in your teaching a few weeks or months ago now, we talked about that scene in John 18, is it, where Jesus and Pilate are conversing?
Before Pilate, yeah.
Yeah, and there's this moment where Jesus says, "Well, I came into the world to testify to the truth." And Pilate asks the question, "Well, what is truth?" And in John's brilliant writing style, he just leaves it there because it feels like John's sort of saying, "Well, you know the answer to this. It's Jesus. That Jesus is the truth."
Yeah, and it's the ironic moment in the story where Pilate is face to face with truth and chooses to not recognize it, right, and acknowledge it.
Yes. But then interestingly, so you've got almost this narrative moment which reflects an earlier conversation from John's gospel, because in John 18, you know what, let me give an actual verse. Let's be proper scholars for a second. Verse 38. In John 18, verse 38, Pilate says, what is truth? And the answer is, well, it's Jesus. But what the irony is that Pilate can't recognize that, as you say. But Jesus has spoke to this earlier on in his wonderfully relational building way that he often does in John's gospel, where he's talking to a group of people and he says to them, "You are from your father, the devil." So really, really warming himself to his listeners. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. So when he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and a father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Now, there's if you think about what Jesus is doing there, if we can read through this sort of what feels like very harsh and insulting language, Jesus is opening up the possibility that you can commit yourself to falsehood to such an extent that you're unable to recognize truth anymore. Now that's just an optional way to read John chapter 8. You have committed to a way of lies, and therefore when I turn up and tell the truth, you can't trust it. You don't trust what I'm saying. You do not believe me. The word belief is also the word trust in Greek. So I think there's an interesting way in which Jesus is saying here in John chapter 8, that's verses 44, 45, and 46, he's almost saying what we were just talking about, that neuroscientists are saying, that actually it is possible to get to a point that you physically can't recognize something true because you've committed to a false narrative. And so I'm always excited when I see, actually something that Jesus is saying here kind of lines up with other stuff we know from elsewhere. I always think that's pretty neat. But I mean, do you see that in how I'm piecing that there?
Yeah, and I mean, as a complete side note, I'm thankful we maybe were in our lane a few moments ago talking about neuroscience. We weren't so out in left field. But yeah, it is, and I mean, and John strings this idea of truth all the way through. You see it right in John 1. John starts with it. The Word becomes flesh, and he's full of grace and truth, or grace and truth are in him, and he's setting up the entire narrative to help people understand this is what truth looks like in action. This is how truth shows itself in the world, that goes way beyond. Yes, there's absolutely an understanding verbally, audibly, understanding some knowledge. But it goes so much deeper than that. There's an example. There's a way that that truth behaves. That goes beyond language. That goes beyond just word.
Yes,
and into a way of living and being and behaving. And I think it's one of the biggest critiques, you see of Jesus, that Jesus gives to the religious elite, the Pharisees, and the people he has conversations with. They're always coming at him with scripture. They have a knowledge of truth, but there's a way that truth wants to behave in the world that they're completely missing. And that is the biggest critique, right?
Yes.
Jesus isn't saying, well, you didn't, you misquoted a word there. He's going, no, you don't understand what that's actually saying, what that actually means, the implications of it. Right. And how that walks out day to day. And so I love how John strings it through. And these are the things that I think we sometimes can miss in just the reading of gospels and narratives and any sort of book in the Bible. We can just read it. You open a chapter. If we're not carefully looking at it, sometimes these are details that are there that bring the scripture to life in new ways that sometimes can get overlooked.
And brief aside before I then kind of throw in some extra thoughts. You mentioned John chapter 1, and that's sort of the way that sets up, not the subject we're talking about just now, but listen, if you have a free hour, if anybody has a free hour, you got to go listen to the Bible podcast, the Bible Project's podcast from the end of October. I think it's the 25th. I've got the number written down here. It's number 273. So if you go to the Bible Project and listen to episode 273, they do this intro to John. They just do this kind of exploration of John 1. If you are interested in biblical text and what John's doing in his gospel, just phenomenal. Like really worth.
They're
really
brilliant.
Worth, listen. And so yeah, that is a little. So back to the point you're making, I think that what John does, everything you're saying, I fully agree with. The piece then that we add to that is that if there's almost a little logic circle you can get into. If Jesus is truth and Christians are called to be followers of Jesus, but also embodiers of Jesus, we somehow become Christ-like, then truth becomes an identity piece for Christians. The truth telling becomes the shape of our discipleship and the shape of our lives, which I think is why John makes it so central to his gospel, because I've written these things so you might trust in Jesus, and therefore I part of the trust in Jesus is to live and embody truth in the way that Jesus calls us to. So there's this kind of, we've really created this there's a lot of little moving parts in this image that we've drawn, but really important moving parts wherein resisting falsehood is as much about identifying with Jesus, and as well as it is about being able to identify Jesus, requires you to resist falsehood. So you get in this sort of this double spin, for want of a better metaphor, to explain what I'm seeing.
Yeah, it's and I mean, and I think this is where, unfortunately, the church capital C has had a bad time. at least, well, I mean, more recently. And when I say more recently, I think it's because of the world of the digital era and, information, this is the biggest kind of move since the printing press. With all the way the digital world is working, so things are way more public than they've ever been before, and there's good and bad to that. And I think the church has taken some hits, and valid ones, I think, too. Because if we are going to follow Jesus, we need to be truth tellers, and when we're not telling the truth and you get called out for it, that's a part of growing and necessary work. But it airs out into the whole world, and then lots of conversations and people that then it hurts a lot of people, especially when these narratives start to pile on top of each other. But this is the actual walking out of truth telling that I think the church just actually has to get better at. And I'm not sure. Well, I have some theories maybe as to why we haven't necessarily done this well. And I think some of it is very much protecting institution, protecting, structures,
Mhm.
organizations, those types of things that it's almost like we're afraid that that Jesus is going to stop sustaining his church if we tell the truth. If something has gone wrong, and we try to cover it up, it's like we don't actually believe that Jesus is the one that's building the church. Um,
Mhm.
and we take things into our own hands, and that's always a recipe for disaster. um so this is the difficult part, is now what is it, what does it mean to actually practically be a truth telling church? If
Mhm.
Jesus is the truth and we're called to, be examples of that, practically speaking, what does that actually look like for us? Because it's easy for us to say, yeah, we should be models of truth, and leave it at that, and say, yeah, that's a good idea. But practically speaking, that's that's the difficult part. Because I
Mhm.
don't think anyone would disagree with you, with us on the, again, on another statement of we should be a truth telling culture. I think even the churches and places that have found themselves in trouble would agree with that.
Mhm.
The ones that get named in this book would probably say, yeah, truth is an important piece.
Mhm.
Yet it's not always done.
Yeah, I think here's could I say that I see a web of ideas, and actually, as I say that as a metaphor, the circle of Tov actually is probably let's just stick with the metaphor that's on the table. The here's my take for what it's worth. All of
Sure.
these things are required. This circle that we're painting throughout this series, that we're kind of obviously borrowing from Mcknight and Barringer's book. They all have to work together. So I feel like I'm doing a bad job of explaining a lot of ideas in my head all at once. So let me try but if you don't get grace right,
Yes.
then you won't get truth right. Let me just say that,
Sure.
for a moment. So there's other things we could talk about as well. Because let's just throw them in. If you don't put people first and get grace right and get truth right, so you look at something like Willow Creek. It appears that such a massive organization as they were,
Yeah.
the problem of telling the truth about what was going on just had too much complexity attached to it, right?
Right.
And so but shift all of that to so essentially you make a decision not to be people first, and all of a sudden truth telling becomes harder, right? But let's go back to, we mentioned it the last time you and I talked, but your friend that you interviewed
Yeah.
a while ago, he told a story in his podcast, in the podcast that you did with him, for Westside. He talked about his youth group and how in his youth group, and correct me if I'm misquoting him here, in his youth group, a whole bunch of the kids were all sleeping with a whole bunch of the other kids, right? And sort of young people, rather. Let me just clarify. So there was a lot of consenting people sleeping together. Right?
Yeah. They were adults, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It was a
just in
church
case.
plant. Church plant.
Yes, and then one couple realized, hey, I don't think this is the way of Jesus. I don't think this is
Yes.
good what we're doing.
Yep.
So we're actually going to seek some help
Yes.
in this. So they go to the leaders and say, hey, listen, this is where we're at, and we need some help. And the net
Yeah.
result is they're excluded from the community. Right?
Correct. Yeah.
They're shamed and kicked out. Right. So
Yeah.
let's take that. So he's put that story out there. So we'll just piggyback on the back of that story for a
Yeah.
second. That's what I mean when I say if you don't get grace right, you don't get truth right.
Yes.
Because what you just do in that simple moment there is you identify, I don't think this is the right, and let's not get drawn into the questions of what these young people are doing. But the
Sure.
point is that the moment you remove grace, you immediately increase the stakes of telling the truth, and you give people good reason then not to tell the truth.
Totally.
Right, because the rest of the young people, and as your friend said, this was a huge problem for him because he's like, I know what's going on here. But now everybody's just decides in one go, well, there is no chance we're telling the truth now here. Why is everybody not telling the truth now? Is it because they're liars? Let's go back to John. Is it because they're liars and their father was a liar, and
Yeah.
and they're all liars from the beginning? Actually, I would argue no. Actually, what's happened is they've realized they're in a context and a culture where grace is in short supply, and therefore the truth telling becomes dangerous. And I feel like the church should be the sort of place where truth telling is incentivized, not the opposite, right?
Well,
you see my brilliant command of the English language there, where I can't think of what the opposite of incentivized is.
It's all good.
But that sense of importance to say, if we're going to live in truth, there's scaffolding that goes around that, and too often I see this all the time. We need to get serious and tell the truth. Well, yes, but not on its own. Right?
Yes.
like we're the truth. Are we committed to the truth with grace? Are we committed to the truth with people first? Are we committed to the truth to avoid, becoming people who lack compassion? So you think about where we're at. We're at truth. We've done compassion, people first, and grace. But it's interesting that now we can get to truth. Right?
Yeah.
Because I think how dangerous it would even be just to put truth at the beginning of that conversation, which many of us like to do. Christians got to be about the truth. Well, yes, and
Totally. Well, and this is even why, certain evangelistic tactics don't work, because yes, you may be wanting to tell people about the truth and the person who is truth. But without some of these other pieces to it, I know even just personally, if I would take truth, even truth that hurts and, is hard to face in the moment, I would take it better from someone like you, who's my friend, who's invested a lot in, has had a lot of conversations with me, knows me, right? Like there's a friendship and a level of trust even, right? Compared to if you said, hey, go, if you even gave the message to someone I didn't know and just said, hey, go tell Tyson this, and they came to me, well, I'm shutting down a whole lot quicker, because who are you? You don't know me. You don't care for me. At least I don't know any of that. You might, but there's no proof of that.
Yeah.
There's no example lived of that tells me that that's, that's the way it is. So I'm not going to listen as closely. I'm not going to. And so I agree completely.
And yet it might be the same truth. The same truth might be being told.
Exactly. It might be you could say it verbatim, but the mouth that it comes from would matter based on some of these other things. Because I know the grace I've received from you before or whatever, right? Like to go, there's safety here. There's care here. There is a care about me as a person first, more than just trying to smack someone with a truth to, bring the rod in and correct them.
Yes.
And those are all pieces. And that's where, they get into it in this book about this idea of Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement and this festival of being committed to truth telling and unpacking even scripture of us, being people of confession together, right? And sacrifice and repentance and all of these things, right? That are all a part of this Jewish kind of culture, but are a reminder of, what it means to be a truth-telling people. And he goes on to quote, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and this idea of how we cheapen grace when we remove some of these things.
And I think that, like you mentioned, Yom Kippur, and I think that's a really interesting process. That so you've got this festival. This is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Literally, Yom is day in Hebrew. Kippur is the word that we translate atonement. One of the beautiful things about Yom Kippur is it's an annual festival.
Yeah.
So nobody goes into Yom Kippur festival thinking, I wonder if we'll all get forgiven this year. Okay. So like that's the purpose of the festival. You are going to be forgiven by the end of this festival, and that forgiveness will be your year-long forgiveness. As a nation, we're forgiven.
Yeah.
And now think about it. When you know that forgiveness is promised, so this is, think about this in the grace, forgiven. There's a gift in the midst of the word forgiven. If you know that forgiveness is going to happen, that makes it a lot easier to tell the truth, right? Makes it a lot easier to come and bring your brokenness before that. So for me, that's a really important component of the repetitiveness of the Yom Kippur festival. We know it's going to happen here. Same is true of Jesus. The reason we can, what is it they talk about in Hebrews? We can approach the throne of grace with confidence. Why can we be confident? Why can we approach God confidently? Well, because we already know God's ruling on us and His grace and His acceptance. So there's almost a fight for us to keep perpetrating that gracefulness, so that the culture of truth and openness is present in the community, but then being brave enough. I think about this in the amount of pastors that over my career have had their ministries fall apart on them because a decision was made by them at some early point, and they didn't feel there was anyone that could go and tell the truth to. So lies start to get stacked upon lies.
Yeah.
Moral failures get stacked upon moral failures. And by the time the truth comes out, because I say this a lot to anybody that'll listen, but I often think the truth is remarkably buoyant. The old saying, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has even got its shoes on. Right? That's true. But I also, I am when I'm not injured as I am right now, but I'm a distance runner. So it's like, you see all these sprinters and they go, I can run 5K in 14 minutes and I cannot run 5K in 14 minutes.
Is 5K considered a sprint, just as a point of clarity from like
it can be by some people, right? Okay.
To me, like up the stairs is a sprint in my books, but I'm just
but I remember one day we were talking to someone in in a group of runners and someone's like, oh, I can run a 5K at this point. And one of my friends was like, yes, but could you do that 20 times? Because they were like a really, really long distance runner, right? So they were in the process of training for 100K, and I feel like that's the metaphor of the truth. The lies may move fast and quick, but the truth's a marathon runner, and eventually, not only will the truth catch up, but it will win, right? And so I feel like we can tell lies, and lies become this process of suppressing and keeping lies down, but eventually they come out, which is why I've often found myself reminding myself in my own life, in my own leadership, don't tell lies. Number one, they're very hard to remember. I'm always there's always a part of me in a weird way is impressed by people that can maintain lies for a long period of time, because I'm like, I don't understand. I have enough trouble remembering my colleagues' names, much less falsehoods about them.
I can vouch for that because you did call a colleague the wrong name today.
Yes, it's true. And, worked with him for 3 years and got his name wrong in the office. and so there's always that sense of goodness, that's hard work to remember that. But there's always also, on a more serious level, the truth that the truth floats. It will eventually come out.
And this is the biblical teaching of darkness and light, right?
Yes, absolutely.
The light always comes into the dark, right? And the darkness cannot overcome it, meaning it can't stand it. At some point in time, it comes to the light. It comes forward. It's that buoyancy piece that you're saying. It comes to the surface and it is acknowledged. And the longer it's buried, the uglier it is when it comes up.
And you have to acknowledge that when it eventually comes up.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing this in the kind of truth and reconciliation process within Canada. You can't just move on. You have to acknowledge the truth. You have to, and this is really what Bonhoeffer's talking about with his kind of cheap grace movement.
Yeah.
That once you get the weightiness of grace and you start to learn of what grace can actually cope with, that actually is important. it's important to know that grace can cope with things. It doesn't just go, oh, okay, you did wrong, no worrying, let's move on. It's actually, no, we can come to confession. I'm a huge fan of Psalm 51. We read it every year at the beginning of Lent. Psalm 51, where David approaches God going, I have royally screwed up. David starts a web of lies that leads to murder and abuse and rape and all sorts of horrendous behavior. And he comes to God and has to pour all that out before God, but he's able to do it because he knows that not a cheap grace of a God who will go, there, that didn't really matter, let's move on, but a God who will actually let all of that come out and deal with it and still love him and still show mercy towards him. And I feel like that's a model for us. Like we cannot complain about people telling lies until we make it until we make our communities, our friendships, safe places to tell the truth. And I feel that's at some level, that's the core thing that we've got to wrestle with. That's the thing that we as leaders need to wrestle with. But then we as congregation, as community members, we need to say, are we okay being part of a community that will tell the truth and have grace for the truth as well? And that's big.
Yeah. And that's the fascinating part about scripture is, a lot of the people that, would get kind of tagged heroes of the faith are, the scripture gets put together of telling the truth about humans' failures and God's goodness in light of it, right? You look at story after story, like Abraham tells lies, right? Like Moses gets himself in trouble, David gets himself in trouble, right? Jacob gets himself in trouble. Like the list goes on, and right. And God's not afraid to tell the truth of those things and expects us to, be truth tellers in the same way. And I think that's an important point to understand, because, grace is costly and truth is costly. Like they go hand in hand, but they're costly things in and of itself, because to be truth telling is going to cost something. Because sometimes it's the more difficult thing to do, at least in the short term. Sometimes it's going to be painful. Sometimes it's going to be sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable. Sometimes, right? It's going to require us to change something. To move stuff, right? Like those are telling the truth is a cost to a community as well, because it requires us to extend forgiveness, to extend grace, and to move into different behaviors.
And sorry for shuffling around some pages. A few things I wanted to add into what you're saying there. One is just a quote from Church Called TOV. Almost a little poetic piece. I don't know if you spotted it when you're reading the book, from Wade Mullen, where he says this: sorrow is feigned, confession is partial, forgiveness is exploited, restitution is an afterthought, and reconciliation is an illusion, as long as truth remains unnamed. So let me read that again. Sorrow is feigned, confession is partial, forgiveness is exploited, restitution is an afterthought, and reconciliation is an illusion, as long as truth remains unnamed. And I love the way the phrase that all these things that we would want require truth at the foundational point, which kind of almost goes back to where we started. And just one other thing, Tyson, if I can say before we end, I was struck by I'm going to say this, and it just makes me sound like a real weirdo. I realize when I say this, but I was reading some historical articles of the faith of the Episcopalian Church earlier today, and who entirely knows why. And this is from 1801, right? And so it's in Article 26 of the Episcopalian Church, in their 1801 Articles of Religion. it deals with the question, and it's really fascinating. It deals with the question of what do we do when we discover that our minister isn't good, right? Or is evil. I use the language of evil, really intense, right? So you've been going to church for years, and you've been being served the sacraments by someone who it turns out later wasn't a good person, actually, or to use their language, was an evil person. What do we do with that? Because now this is an interesting one, because I've faced this question in my own life before. So I've been in a couple of churches now, in my younger years, where the kind of significant staff member or leading pastor had a moral failure. And I remember in my early 20s being in a church where that was the case, and several of the young people sort of came to me and said, what do we do with everything we learned from this pastor now? Because, we've been listening to his sermons for years, and should we throw out all of those notes and forget all of those lessons? Because this person's been saying this stuff to us, but now they've done this immoral thing. Should we abandon them? And so in 1801, they had this question of, well, what do we do? And they made this statement, which I loved. They said, in the church, evil will always be mingled with the good, right? Which I thought, goodness, that's so harsh. I mean, we're 200 years old sort of language there. But I found it almost refreshing to remind myself of that Jesus is good, and he calls us into the church of goodness. The problem is I go, right? And you go, and we all go. And the problem is I'm not always good, right? Actually.
Yeah.
And I'm a little uncomfortable using 1801 language of I am evil, but actually maybe I need to own that just for a little second. And so this article, I won't read the whole thing, but this article essentially says, yeah, you're always going to get evil and good in the same place in the church. And then it says, and sometimes the evil might even rise to the surface. It might even, I'm using paraphrase language, sometimes evil might end up in charge. It talks about it being the chief authority. But then it makes this confession. It says that Christ and Christ's ordinance, so it's talking about the sacraments, communion, that sort of stuff. Yeah. Christ and Christ's ordinance are not taken away by wickedness, and the grace of God is not diminished by this either. So then it goes on to basically say, receive communion from whoever offers it to you, because communion is a bigger deal than the brokenness of the person that serves you. And I found myself thinking, like what a beautiful thought to remember. The truth, even when presented to us by broken people, is still true, right? And that grace, even when presented by people who actually need that grace, is still graceful. There's a further category in the paragraph which says, however, when you find out that people are evil, you should deal with that. So it's not saying just yes. live with it and don't do anything. But I thought, what, that I feel like that's an important thing to keep confessing, that we're looking for goodness in this series. We're talking about how do we be a good church, not a perfect church. So a perfect church has nothing evil in it. Here's the problem: you would not be able to go there, right? And there's two sayings I love at that point. One, which is, if you ever find a perfect church, don't go, you'll ruin it. And I like that. Yeah. But my favorite is Brennan Manning's quote. He said, when people used to come up to him and say, he was a priest, and they would say, I wouldn't come to church because it's full of sinners. And Manning used to reply, well, it's not full yet. There's still room for you.
Yeah. I like that.
And I kind of think that's probably where I'd park this sort of thought process this evening, Tyson. But I said a lot there. So do you want to round us out and land us?
Sure. And I love everything that you just said about the good and the evil and how that comes together. And I think there's a unique opportunity for the church as we grow in what it means to be a truth-telling culture. I think people want to be genuinely known for who they are, both the good and the bad in that. I think they want to tell the truth about who they are, about the experiences they have and the things they face. And And I actually think we're discovering more of that desire because of the curation of culture around us, to bring it back to where we maybe started the conversation. I think the church has a unique opportunity
Mhm.
to, obviously with grace and people first and compassion, and to give people the space to tell the truth, to discover who they really are. Um, as humans, as creations, as creatures, as however you want to frame it. I think we're at a crossroads for the church, and the opportunity is massive if the church
Mhm.
is willing to embark on the difficult road of telling the
Mhm.
truth. I'm willing to bet that there's huge healing that could happen for a large number of people,
Mhm.
um, if we're willing to give them the space
Mhm.
to tell the truth, to be open about their experiences, to um, yeah, to say it as it is, in some senses, of what they're seeing, of what they're thinking, of what they're frustrated with, of what they're
Mhm.
uh, the baggage that they've carried. I think people are tired of telling half truths. I think they're
Mhm.
tired of curating an identity. I think they're tired of putting on a front. It's why you see a big push for authenticity, and even that has become curated again in social circles
Yeah.
and those types of things. But the irony of it is just outrageous, as much as the no filter hashtag.
Mhm.
But I think there's a genuine desire for that, and I actually
Mhm.
think um, churches that will thrive moving forward will
Mhm.
be churches that are graceful, are people first, are compassionate, and are truth telling communities from the stage, and allow people to tell the truth from, as a part of the community, and are
Mhm.
and are still welcomed with open arms. And
Mhm.
again, it comes back to this idea of, it's messy. I think the church has to be ready to roll up their sleeves a little bit, um,
Mhm.
and get a little messy.